to Old Path in our study through the Old Testament. We are currently in the book of Ezra, and we get to chapters 3 and 4 today. If you were here on the first week, we went through the first couple of chapters, and I had mentioned there that the first 6 chapters deal with the time before Ezra is really mentioned and comes into the narrative. What we're looking at here is the first of the group that comes in at the decree of Cyrus and for the rebuilding of the temple. And the one thing I think you could take from this, if you were to just put out the premise that God wants to put his people back in the land, and in doing so, he really wants to put them back for the express purpose initially of the rebuilding of the temple for a place of corporate worship. So if I was to just throw out the question to you, do you think that in the process that they would run into some kind of opposition? And I think to a person we would probably say, well, sure, if the devil has any hand in the whole thing, he's going to try to stir up opposition. And so that is exactly what we will see takes place. And it is helpful for us, I would think, as we kind of look at this in the topical sense. It does lend itself to that kind of an application, that you would think we should expect opposition when God wants to do something in and through us, and really he should be working in us at all times. That's a better way to say it, that for the believer, our relationship with him is supposed to be an all-day, everyday type of thing, and he would constantly have us doing things that would be in service to him as we serve him, serving others, whether in the church or out of the church. No matter what it is, it's kind of a 24/7, 365 kind of thing. So every single day that we awake, and for all the time that we're doing the things that we're doing through the course of the day, we should expect that there would be opposition to what we do. The devil will look to stir up any kind of opposition that he possibly can, and this world itself is never going to be our friends. It's always going to be adversarial towards us because it doesn't respect the things that we respect and believe. So the thing oftentimes that you find around churches, for some, to me, inexplicable reason, there is almost this presumption, I would think, that we should be able to get along with things, and maybe the world won't believe what we do, but that somehow we can think that we can exist in a world without hostilities towards us. And if we're going to take a biblical view of our lives and making a biblical application of how it is that we're supposed to conduct ourselves, the world's never going to like us. Jesus told us that, and we could see it played out in the early church. So the unbelieving world is not going to be acceptable, or accepting rather, of those things that we believe if we're vocal about them and if we live them out. So it shouldn't be something that a believer gets beaten down by in the spiritual sense, and it shouldn't get us to the point of feeling sad or whatever else. It should just be, well, the world is able to recognize, because our lives demonstrate that we belong to him, and as we grow in our relationship with him, his priorities become our priorities. Well, in the passage that we're looking at here, clearly the priorities were that God was done with his time of them being banished from the land. That 70 years had come to an end. And so he stirs up, as we saw in the first study, a group of people that are going to go back and begin the process of rebuilding the temple. And so we get to the point here where they're now in the land and they're beginning that process. And there are the people who are going to begin the building and doing all of what they're supposed to do. We're going to also notice at the very beginning of this, and I think it is incredibly significant and really easy for us to forget, they come back after a 70-year absence, plus whatever it took for them to get everything together and get there. And even in that, they knew what they were supposed to do. Now, there had been times in their history when it's pretty evident from what we see there that they were not doing anywhere near what they should have been doing as far as the corporate worship of the nation. If you were studying through especially the last chapters of the book of Chronicles, you'll know that when Josiah had finally become king and well into his reign, they had found a book of the law and realized that even what they were doing, because of Josiah's right heart before God, was nowhere near what it should have been, when they actually had a chance to see it spelled out in the law. And it had an incredible reforming effect on the nation. Well, as they come back here, it would appear as though they have things the way that they're supposed to be, and they're doing things in accordance with what should have been being done throughout the entirety of their history. And let's just let me go ahead and say it. I think it's pretty obvious. From the time of David, if they had followed the direction that he had given to them, and if you had a successive king just like David, and in the first part of Solomon's rule, if they were all that same way, and what I mean by that is if the king had been careful to follow what was already written for them in the law, and God had already settled and established them in Jerusalem, they already had a temple in place, the place for corporate worship for the entire nation was already in place, all of those things were set there, and there was a promise to David that if his children, those generations after him, would walk in his ways as David had and done the things according to the law. And if there had not been a break in that and a movement away from it and doing evil and wicked things, there never would have been a captivity. So here they come back after those 70 years with Zerubbabel, and there's priests and Levites, and they're doing the things that they're supposed to do. But here's the thing again that can be so easily missed. This is after they have been displaced from the land for a very long time, but somebody had preserved the writings of their history. And so we know that from the genealogies, those were kept. And by the actions of the people who came back with Zerubbabel, you can tell that there are things that they were doing that were in accordance with the law as well. So all of that was preserved in their captivity. I'm of the opinion, as we read through it, I believe that Cyrus would have been shown the prophecy made about him through Isaiah almost 200 years prior. And here Cyrus would have been able to see in writing his name mentioned and what God would have him to do, a couple of centuries later. So that would mean that they would have had to have preserved their writings during their captivity, and even the transition from the Babylonians, first with Nebuchadnezzar and then being conquered by Cyrus and the Persians. There's all this transition, and yet they've been able to preserve everything that was their corporate worship. If we remember what Daniel did when he was in captivity, during that that time that they were there during the Persian times, basically the book of Daniel is looking towards that, from the transition of Babylonian to Persian. And we know that there are a number of things that he did, and that he was obviously keeping in the right sense, the proper worship and praying towards Jerusalem and doing all of those things. So there was clearly an understanding, and they had preserved that during their time of captivity. It's a pretty significant thing. It's a very interesting thing, in fact. So as we look through that, looking now here as they've come back, with all of that in place, they come back and they're doing those right things. Now, when we get a chance to look at the feasts that began here that we're going to see in the first of these chapters, it's important to recognize what those different feasts were. And I want to put up for you when we get there a picture. It's actually just a JPEG file, but it'll show the different types of offerings that were being offered here. And burnt offerings are mentioned prominently. So a burnt offering was a voluntary offering, and it was kind of a making of peace as far as man, or it was more of a submission, a better way of putting it, because there were peace offerings. But it was a submission of man to God and a recognition of offering oneself to Him. And so the burnt offering would be something absolutely consumed. So the entire offering, there was no priestly portion of it. There was no portion for the person who was offering it. And so a burnt offering was something consumed totally by the fire, offered up to the Lord with nothing held back. And so again, that idea of submission. It's the one that's mentioned primarily in this, also the mention of the keeping the Feast of Tabernacles. So chapter 3 is where we start. Let's turn there, and then let's have a word of prayer. Father, we thank you as we come to your word. We are made aware just how important that your word is to us and our understanding of who you are, especially when we read these kinds of historical events, and the recognition that we want to put the historical parts of it in their proper context and let them by themselves there to be there. But then also, how can we learn from what we read, and what is the takeaway for our own hearts and minds and our own understanding? So I pray, God, that you would open our eyes and that we would make proper application to what we read here, and we give you all thanks and praise in Jesus' name. All right, so chapter 3 begins this way. It says, "Now in the 7th month, when the 7th month had come, the children of Israel were in the cities, and the people gathered together as one in Jerusalem." Now, the first part of this, there are kind of two schools of thought. Is it 7 months after they had began to gather themselves in Persia to make the trek back, or is it according to their calendar, their 7th month? If it was their 7th month, it would probably be a reference to it. What we have here in chapter in the 8th verse of this, it talks about the second year and the second month, and we'll see that there's kind of the impression that it is according to their own calendar. This first part may very well be, it could be their calendar, or it could be the calendar of when everything started in place. However it would be, they're there at this particular time. Verse 2, Jeshua, the son of Jozadak, and his brethren, the priests, Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and his brethren, they arose to build the altar of God in Israel, to offer burnt offerings on it, as it is written in the law of Moses, the man of God. So this tells you once again that they have the law, which is great, because that means that they have the source code, if you will, of what to do. And as it was with Josiah, from best we can tell, and just by kind of putting the pieces together, whatever it was that they were doing had to have been handed down traditions, because they found a book of the law, and it was only then that they realized how far out of the way things should have been that the real reforms took place. In this case, it says that they had this already in existence. They did these things according to what Moses had written. So it says, "Now through fear they had come upon them, though fear had come upon them because of the people of those countries, they set the altar on its basis, and they offered burnt offerings to the Lord, both in the morning and the evening burnt offerings." So almost hit the ground running, put in place an altar before anything else takes place, and allow people of their own free will to offer to God, this idea of submitting themselves to Him. And really at this point, it does end up training up the person to do these things in a repeating sense, and it keeps them in the place of offering before God. It keeps Him on the forefront of their mind, and this is a good thing for them. So notice what is also said here in verse 3. There was a genuine fear. There was a concern that they had, because the people who were inhabiting the land right there, as we're going to see, it becomes very obvious, there was a reason for their fear. The people of the land didn't want them there, and were going to do everything that they could to thwart this work of rebuilding the temple and doing everything that really they had been sent back to do. But initially, the only thing that they had in mind is, let's get our proper worship before the Lord in place. That is really the priority of things. And so we're going to find that they kind of lulled themselves into, just kind of hitting their stride, if you will, but not being really diligent about things. If you are to take a look at the book of Haggai, you will find that whole book is dedicated basically to this time shortly after their return, and God sends Haggai to the people. The people of at this place, obviously, it's the time that Judah has returned, and it's just in the first chapter that you see there that God stirs him up to go to the leadership and to say, why is there such a delay here? In fact, it's kind of an indictment, because they had seen to their own dwellings, if you read his book. So Minor Prophet, if you're not familiar with it, it's great to read because it's a parallel to this. If you want to know the era of time, your kind of parallel book that really deals with this portion of the time is the book of Haggai. So go check that out, and you'll see the really interesting parallels. In fact, if time permits, maybe we'll go take a look over there very quickly. But it's great parallel reading if you'd like. So in verse 4, it says, "So they also kept the Feast of Tabernacles." So the second of the things that are said here as far as keeping the feasts. Tabernacles would be a reminder of their time of their sojourning in the wilderness. Interesting that it's getting mentioned here because they've just had another time of captivity at the hands of the Babylonians, now into the Persians, and God has yet again brought them back into the land as he had brought them to it for the first time as the tribes. So they keep that as well. That gives us an understanding of what time of year it was. And so it tells us they kept the Feast of Tabernacles as it is written. They offered daily burnt offerings in the number required by ordinance for each day. Again, it is in the proper context, biblically speaking, of when and how they would be doing the offerings. They're doing it right by the book is a great way of putting it. So afterwards, they offered the regular burnt offerings, and for those of the new moons, and for the appointed feasts of the Lord that were consecrated, and for everyone who willingly offered a free will offering to the Lord. So as time goes on, they begin to add in those things. They're doing things as they're supposed to do. And then it's going to get, by the time we get to verse 8, there's some time has lapsed since the beginning of it, and they're on in the keeping of the feasts and the offerings and everything, they're on schedule. Verse 6, "Now from the first day of the 7th month they began to offer burnt offerings to the Lord, although the foundation of the temple of the Lord had not yet been laid." Now some people can look at that and say it's a matter of priorities, and that it's a good thing that they had put that down. But as you read Haggai, the way that that's written there is that God says you're at the pace that you're doing things, you should be doing all of it at the same time. Instead, your priorities are wrong. You're doing the offerings and all that, but you're not building the temple yet. You're building houses for yourselves. And so there's this problem with priorities, and you can already start to see it if you're reading into it and reading the parallel things. So, in fact, let's go. Let's turn to the book of Haggai. And it really only takes a few verses to get a flavor for this in chapter 1. And just remember, there's a few chapters to it. It's not terribly long. So a couple of chapters is what we're looking at here. And it says to us, in the 2nd year of King Darius, in the 6th month, on the 1st day of the month, the word of the Lord came to Haggai, the prophet, and then to Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, the governor of Judah, and to Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest, saying, "Thus speaks the Lord of hosts, saying, this people says, the time has not come, the time that the Lord's house is to be built." And then the word of the Lord came by Haggai the prophet, saying, "Is it time for you yourselves to dwell in paneled houses, and this temple to lie in ruins? Now therefore, thus says the Lord of hosts, consider your ways." So, interesting. When you start to see this, they're not far into the process, and God is already beginning to take them to task for their delay in what they should be doing. So, does God want them to have a place to dwell? Yes. Does he want them to have the sacrifices and do everything the way that it's supposed to do? Yes. Does he want them also to be looking at making the formal facade of the place, the building itself, and consecrating that? Does he want that done at the same time? The answer to that is clearly yes, all of the above, but he wants to make sure that the priority, of course, it's a given. The priority is to make sure that the sacrifices, that people are in a right place of fellowship with him. But the next in the way of priorities, let them live in tents if they must until God's house is built, rather than build themselves someplace and then get to God's place later. So he confronts them on it. Now back to chapter 3 of Ezra. So it tells us in verse 8, "Now in the 2nd month of the 2nd year of their coming to the house of God at Jerusalem, Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, Jeshua, the son of Jehozadak, And the rest of the brethren, the priests and the Levites, and all of those who had come out of the captivity to Jerusalem, began work at the appointed, that was appointed rather, the Levites from the appointed, and they rather appointed rather from 20 years old and above, to oversee the work of the house of God. So verse 9, then Jeshua with his sons and brothers, Kadmiel with his sons and the sons of Judah, arose as one to oversee those working on the house of God, the sons of Henadad with the sons of their brethren, the Levites. And when the builders had laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, the priests stood in their apparel with trumpets, and the Levites, the sons of Asaph, with cymbals, to praise the Lord according to the ordinances of David, the king of Israel. And they sang responsively, praising and giving thanks to the Lord, saying this, for he is good and his mercy endures forever. And then towards Israel is added in there, but that's taken directly from Psalm 136, verse 1. So here's what you find is that they not only have the Mosaic, the work of the law being done, the work of the sacrifices and everything else, but now they're also implementing the things that David had introduced, which was worship and people who were in the place of making sure that worship was done. And the one thing that's mentioned here that they were being led in doing is referring to God and talking about how he is faithful. Now, this is where you start to get into that time when shortly after God is going to begin speaking through prophets to tell them, let's get things in their proper place, as we had just read. Now, verse 11, the second half of it says, then all the people shouted with a great shout, and they praised the Lord because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. Now let's stop here because it's important. The foundation stone means it's kind of the cornerstone, usually is how it would be laid out, but they would have to put down the foundation. And it would take some time for them to build the rest of the walls, to build the roof on it, to put in the rooms, to do all of what it was going to take. It was not going to happen quickly. But to lay the foundation really means there is a commitment that you are going to do this thing. Now, there's a debatable thing in this, and depends on who you read on it. I think it's pretty clear when you look at the text. It seems to me really there's only one option that we can look in this. But there is a reaction depending on the people that you're looking at when they first see the foundation stone being laid. And here's the two schools of thought. There are some people here that are mentioned as they weep. And there are others also that that says that they are shouting out for joy. Now, it says that there are some older people, those who saw the other temple, so they're very much aged by this time. And when they see the foundation stone laid, they believe that this is what causes them to weep, because they see that it's going to be inferior. Now, you get a little bit of a sense of that when you read in Haggai in chapter 2, and I think it's in verse 3, when it talks about the people who saw it, just saw that it was really nothing like what Solomon's temple was, and there was they were distressed by that. But if this is just the foundation stone, the reaction of these people, the older ones, doesn't seem to much make sense. And so I think it's important for us to recognize that the reaction of these people is more than likely because they see what is now God bringing them back. And they are reminded of what was and why there was the breakdown that there was. They're reminded of the captivity. They're reminded that God has brought them back. And there is a weeping just because of a sense of longing and belonging to the place. But then I can see being tempered also to realize we never should have gotten here in the first place. We shouldn't have to lay another foundation type thing for it. Now, if these men came back and they had seen what was, but they were taken away into captivity, these are people who seem to have very much a vested interest in being here and seeing things put back the way that they should be, or else I don't know why God would have called them back if they didn't care about such things. So when we read through this, the people who don't really, they were probably born, much of this, almost all of them I would think, would have been born in that captivity. Because remember, 70 years has lapsed, and however old they were, that they would have a remembrance of what was, and now they're back in the land. They're obviously well over 70 years old, those who are looking here and weeping as they see it. We're going to hear it mentioned here. They're going to give a brief description of them. So their reaction would be completely different from people who are there just for the very first time. They've maybe heard all of those things, but they've never seen it with their own eyes. So their level of excitement would be, we were born in captivity, now we're being brought back. God has designed us to be here, and there's just an excitement and a joy. And then, as opposed to the people who were taken away in that captivity, who saw the old and are now seeing the new, the range of emotion would be completely different. And I think that's why you see their reaction is different. So let's read it. It says in verse 12, "But many of the priests and the Levites and the heads of the fathers' houses, old men who had seen the first temple, they wept with a loud voice when the foundation of the temple was laid before their eyes, yet many shouted aloud for joy." So again, since it's just the foundation stone, you're not going to know what the end result facade is going to look like. You won't know what the walls will look like. You can assume or hope that it will look like something that Solomon had made. But again, when you read Haggai, it seems pretty obvious that the one that is built here is in ways inferior. In fact, it's going to be down the road. Herod is going to put up his own version of it as well. So we read in verse 13, "So that the people could not discern the noise of the shout of joy from the noise of weeping from the people, for the people shouted with a loud shout, and the sound was heard afar off." And so you have the two different reactions that take place. And so it kind of helps us in our understanding that what has happened here, there is the magnitude that it's not lost on anyone. But depending on your perspective of it, if you've never seen it before, it's the first time you've seen such a thing. And so we're watching history. They would think, the younger people were watching history, and that after being displaced for all of these years, here we're coming back and it's being put back in place, as opposed to the other ones who had been there before and they've had to endure 70 years of captivity and living in another place, probably wondering if they would ever get a chance to see it themselves. They would have known that the captivity was only supposed to last for 70 years. That was already written. So Jeremiah had already given them that. So the idea that they would know that the day would come, and yet they're seeing it with their own eyes. And these would be of the religious order. These are the Levites. These are the priests. So they've been there before. They've seen these things. Now they're brought back, and it's an overwhelming thing. At least that's all what we can tell from the text here. Now in chapter 4, this is, as I had mentioned, to me, I think it's a great example of we can take a look at what happens when God is doing a work, and when his people are stirred to do that particular work. The idea that we would end up seeing adversity, and that we would have pushback from other people who don't want to see any kind of success in us, that should be something that is expected. So the devil will stir up who he can, when he can, in whatever way he can, to try to blunt the work that God is wanting to do in the people as a whole or in the individual. So again, pastoring in a church for a number of years and being around ministry for so many, I can tell you this, that one thing I know for sure, that the devil, if the church is really doing as it should and teaching through the word and instructing the people, and they're growing spiritually, that church, if it's not being careful and it's not being mindful of the things taking place around them, if they're not being vigilant and they're not, trying to again, even prayerfully, be seeking the Lord and looking to him, the devil's going to look to do everything that he can to damage that church. And one of the most effective ways to do that is through the individual. So either stirring them up to try to do damage to the fellowship, or just trying to discourage the individual on an individual basis. Things happening in their lives, things happening around them, threats, whatever the case may be. In this case, we know exactly what is looking to stop the work. It is the people who are around, the ones that we saw in last chapter, that they said that they're afraid of them because they did not trust their motives. Now these very same people that they were afraid of are going to come and offer what seems like their help, but they're not Jewish people. You're going to see as they write a letter to try to slow things down, they don't identify with the nation of Israel, but here they say that they're willing to help. And it just looks like a way to try to infiltrate and really slow the work by seeming as though they're going to somehow be a help. So, just big picture. When we read chapter 4, let us be really, really careful that it's not written for us in the church as some kind of metaphor. What we want to do as the church is to say, let's take a look at this and see what is a good application towards us, that we should understand how the devil does what he does. Here's what we know for sure. This is a work that was being done. It is absolutely something that was prophesied. It's a historical event, and there was opposition to it. So great. Therefore, why does that matter to us? Well, we are in the church also a covenant people. And a covenant people should expect that there is going to be pushback against them, and anything that the devil can try to do to slow down the work of the church, he's going to do it. And then the question becomes, does he have willing participants through ignorance or through complete willfulness? Are they going to kind of accommodate what he wants to do in damaging the church and the work, even to the individual level? That should be obvious. So he doesn't change his tactics, and people tend to be the same way that they were back then. If you're not vigilant, it's easy to get overrun. So, chapter 4. Now, when the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the descendants of the captivity were building the temple of the Lord of Israel, they came to Zerubbabel and the heads of the fathers' houses, and they said to them, "Let us build with you, for we seek your God as you do, and we have sacrificed to him since Esarhaddon, the king of Assyria, who brought us here." So these are clearly not people who cared much for the God that is being spoken of here, because they would have been doing something totally different than what would have been known, because they don't have the writings. They're able to say, we believe in the same God that you do, so why can't we just do all of this side by side? There again, an interesting application, if you will. I know that there are so many people even people who profess to be believers, who operate under this faulty understanding that other religious orders outside of Christianity really do ultimately believe the same God of the Bible. And the most obvious of those is when you talk with people about Islam, it is assumed that the same God that you find revealed in the passages or in the books of the Bible is the same God that is revealed in the writings of the Quran. And nothing could be further from the truth. They are not the same one. And so we can tell that characteristically by the things that they say of themselves. So the God of the Bible, completely different. Best litmus test that you can find. You'll see that throughout the scriptures, old and new, God will tell you that he is personally invested and has walked among his creation because he loves them on an individual basis. So, and it's what causes, it's what is I guess you could say the driving reason why he does the things that he does is because he loves the people. You will not find that spoken of the same way in the Quran. So there are so many other dissimilarities between the two of them that whatever similarities they are often exaggerated, and the dissimilarities are completely ignored. So what we want to make sure that this is a very reminiscent kind of a thing. They want to make it seem like they're all on board to help. We believe in the same God that you do, but notice these people refer to it as that your God, the one that you serve, and then they say we serve him too. Well, there's not a kindredship here, and God, I think, really makes it very obvious to Zerubbabel that these are not people who have any interest in doing the things that that they should, and that they are purporting themselves as wanting to do. Now, if they were genuinely wanting to help and they were genuine worshipers of God, God would not have prevented them. They wouldn't have tried to subvert things from the beginning. They would have wanted to try to prove themselves, and they could have integrated in. It's like what we know from the law. If somebody wanted to come under the law, they were going to have to live according to it, even if they were not Jewish by birth. But they could come and be a part of it, because they could come and worship the God who is to all men. So with that being said, in verse 3, but Zerubbabel and Jeshua, the rest of the heads of the fathers' houses of Israel, said to them, You may do nothing with us to build a house for our God, but we alone will build to the Lord God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, has commanded us. So then the people of the land tried to discourage the people of Judah. They troubled them in the building, and they hired counselors against them to frustrate their purposes all of the days of Cyrus, the king of Persia, even until the reign of Darius, the king of Persia. Now, this creates a little bit of a the letter that ensues from this creates a little bit of confusion, because there was more than one Darius. So we're going to find out that because there's a successful, though I believe temporary, ability for them to stop the work, there are the earlier of the Darius is the one that seems most likely here, and it really helps with understanding that the slowdown of the work was really pretty heavy, and it really lasted for a couple of years by the time that it's all said and done. If you use another Darius that comes much later, then the slowdown would have been a very, very long time, over 100 years, and we know that that's not possible because you still have the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. So if we look at this Darius as the one that was in the line of the succession of kings, it was not long after Cyrus. So Zerubbabel is able to do the things that he does. There's a probably somewhere around on the order of a couple of years from when the letter is received, and then the edict comes down from Darius. So during the time of Cyrus, Zerubbabel has the ability to do all of what they want to do. It's only in that time when Darius puts out this decree that they have to stop for, like I say, around 2 years, from best we can tell. Now, it says, in the reign of Ahasuerus, and that's just another way of saying Xerxes. The beginning of his reign, they wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and of Jerusalem. And then in the days of Artaxerxes also, Bishlam, Mithridath, Tebel, and the rest of the companions wrote to Artaxerxes, the king of Assyria, and the letter was written in Aramaic script and translated into the Aramaic language. Now, I didn't grab one, but it would be very easy if you want to. If you don't already have it, it's a pretty easy thing to find online. Just get the succession of the Persian kings. And so from Cyrus on down, and you can kind of see who the different kings were. It'll help you kind of piece together the timeline of all of this. So, Rahum, the counselor, verse 8, and Shimshai, the scribe, wrote a letter against Jerusalem to King Artaxerxes in this fashion. Now, you're going to notice the thing that is done here. It's an interesting thing, because nowhere did God tell the people coming back into captivity that they were to go back and establish Jerusalem as a power center with a king and raising up an army and starting a nation again. He never did that. By this time, he's pretty much passed judgment on the people as far as the kings are concerned, and he's pretty much cut off that line anyhow. But it doesn't mean that he doesn't want people to not have the land. He's promised it to them. Doesn't want them to not have a place of formal worship. He wanted that to be the case. But remember, Daniel in his captivity had pretty much laid out what the next 4 world empires would be, or the 4 empires, beginning with Babylon into the Persians, then give way to the Greeks, and then to the Romans. Israel's not mentioned as being a world power, and in that part of the world, at times, they were exactly that. David being kind of the pinnacle of it into Solomon's time. But then it degraded from that point on, unfortunately, because kings just did not follow and honor God as they should have, and then the nation split, which just kind of shows it was a downward progression, and it was never going to be anywhere near what it was, especially as a united kingdom from that point on. And so what happens, sadly, from the time of Zerubbabel, and then by the time that Ezra comes, and then Nehemiah, it's not long after Nehemiah's time that really the nation just kind of falls apart yet again, and the priesthood becomes incredibly corrupt, and they fall into a time when God is not speaking in the same way through the prophets as he was until the time of John the Baptist as a precursor to Jesus. So that's during the time of the Maccabees, is in that interval of time, And so it was a pretty bad time, a pretty dark time. Unfortunately, at that point, from the Persians to the Greeks to the Romans, Israel is going to have to be in a place of trying to keep peace with foreign powers that really have jurisdiction over them. So that's, even in this time, we still have the same thing that's going on. God gave the decree through Cyrus, and they've been given the ability to go back and rebuild. But you'll notice that they do so at the good pleasure of the kings of Persia, and the easiest way to try to stop the whole work or to try to destroy it altogether is to make it seem as though the people that were going back with just this idea of rebuilding the temple are really actually just subversives. They're just waiting until they can build the numbers, and they're going to rebel as they have in times past. That's the accusation. And again, if you're going to try to make an accusation that will stick with a foreign government and a foreign king, let them know that in one of your territories there are people that are starting a groundswell that will ultimately lead to rebellion. You'll get a king to listen to that. Well, he did. So, in verse 9 it says, Now from Rahum the commander, Shimshai the scribe, and the rest of the companions, representatives of the Danites, all these ites, and these different groups of people from Persia, from Babylon, from Shushan, the Elamites. This is basically just a way of saying all of those other conquered people through the times of the Assyrians. Remember when they took away the northern tribes, and when Israel was defeated at the hand of the Assyrians, they basically replaced the populations with a whole mix of other cultures and other peoples that were already under the control of the Assyrians, and it really made it difficult for there to be any kind of a root that is left of the people who were the inhabitants of the land. It's just what they did. And so this mishmash of all kinds of people who had been absorbed by the Assyrians were placed in the land, and now they've been there for generations. And these are the people, seeing the Jews come back after all this time of displacement, they're not at all agreeable to having the people from outside of the nation get involved and incorporate among them. They already know what kind of corruption comes with that. So Israel's learned its lesson. Zerubbabel's having no part of it. Well, then the opposition says, okay, let's do this a different way. Let's see if we can turn the Persian king against them. And so here's the accusation. So verse 10, after that whole list of groups in 9, the rest of the nations whom the great and noble Osnapper, another way of looking at him is just another name for the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal. So they took captive, and they settled in the cities of Samaria and the remainders beyond the river and so forth, or in that area. So this is the people who are saying, here's who we are and here is who we represent. Pretty much, it's everybody that's ever been put into this land that is not Jewish. And here is our grievance, here's our problem. To King Artaxerxes, from your servants, the men of the region beyond the river and so forth. Just this group of people, as though they're trying to make it seem like we're so grateful for you, king, and we're part of your territory. I'm sure they hated him. Nobody likes to have somebody rule over them, especially from afar. But apparently, from everything we can see here, it seems pretty obvious they hated the idea of the Jews doing this more than they hated the idea of being under the thumb of Artaxerxes. So again, here's one of those times, before we move on, making application to this, let's remember that the real problem here is a spiritual one. And so the devil stirs up those people to try to stop the work that God is doing. And so why does God allow something like that to happen is a great question. And one of the best answers to it that you can possibly give is it gives us the understanding of what it's like to, even though there are those times when we will have people who oppose us, it does cause us to run to the Lord and depend upon Him. And that's not a bad thing at all. So the idea that God wanted to send His people back to rebuild is, of course, a wonderful thing. The idea that there would be opposition should have been expected, of course. So it says this, Now let it be known to the king that the Jews who came up from you, they have come to us at Jerusalem, and they are building the rebellious and the evil city, and they are finishing its walls and repairing the foundations. None of that is true. So that will be done down the road, but that's not initially what was being done here. All that they were doing was the worship, and they were wanting to build the temple. They haven't even talked about the walls or fortifications or anything else. But from a distance, they're basically saying, we are really with you, Artaxerxes, and we just need to let you know those people that came here with one goal are actually doing something else. They are looking to rebel, and they're already putting in place the ability to do so. So let it be known to you, to the king, if this city is built and its walls are completed, they will not pay tax, they will not pay tribute or custom, and the king's treasury will be diminished. So a secondary thing. Not only will they try to rebel against you, but it will hurt you, it'll hurt your bottom line. This is about as compelling a reason as you could possibly give for the king to intervene in this. All of it is a lie, but it works in the narrative here, and of course it's going to get a response from the king, just like you would expect. So now, because we receive support from the palace, it was not proper for us to see the king dishonored. Therefore, we have sent and informed the king that search may be made in the book of your records of your fathers, and you will find in the book and in the records and know that this city is a rebellious one. So go back and look at the history of it. You'll find out that they have been rebellious before. And it's why, Nebuchadnezzar did the things that he did. They basically point back to what would have been the last years and the last part of the history of Judah. So they're saying you're going to have a repeat of what it was like after Josiah's time in that brief series of the kings afterward. And that's what's being spoken of here. So go back and search your history. You're going to find out that these people are difficult, and you don't want any part of this happening. So, verse 15, search that a search would be made in the book of the records of your fathers, and that you will find in the book of the records and know that this city is a rebellious one. It is harmful to kings and provinces, and that they have incited sedition within the city in former times, for which cause this city was destroyed. So that goes back to, they're going to have to look back into the Babylonian records, because that's when it was taking place, but you'll find that it's there. That's what the accusation is. We inform the king that if this city is rebuilt and its walls are then completed, the result will be that you will have no dominion beyond the river. So that kind of an accusation will certainly be received by the king. But notice how there is so much error in with a little bit of truth. Do they have a history of rebellion? Well, sure they did. The idea that they had, even at that time of rebellion, which was during the descendants after Josiah that we had just studied in those last few chapters of 2nd Chronicles, that part is true. But did they have complete control over everything that was on this side of the Jordan, or anything that was west of the Jordan? Not by a long shot. And were they any kind of a rival that could have mustered an army even at that time against Nebuchadnezzar or against the Persians of this time, even if they were back to that former time? There's nowhere near that kind of manpower. So they mix truth with error, which is just such a hallmark of the devil. And so it's enough that it could get the king to just go, better safe than sorry, let me bring the whole thing to a halt. So in verse 17, the king sent an answer. And then he sends it to, in verse 17, these people, the commander, the scribe, the rest of the companions, the one who dwell in Samaria, and the rest who are beyond the river, which is, everybody that's on that side of the Jordan in the territory that is Israel. So it says in verse 18, the letter which you sent to us has been clearly read before me, and I give this command. And a search that it had been made, and it was found that this city in former times has revolted against kings, and rebellion and sedition have been fostered in it. There have also been mighty kings over Jerusalem, who have ruled over the region beyond the river, and tax and tribute and custom were paid to them. Now give the command to make these men cease, that this city may not be built until the command is given by me. Take heed now that you do not fail to do this. Why should you damage? Why should damage increase to the hurt of the kings? So message sent, message received, and now the people who wanted to see everything stop there they've managed to get exactly what it is that they wanted. Now again, we can make the case that this was about people and territory, and you can make that case, certainly not a problem. There's new people now, and they're starting to seemingly, they seem to have the backing of the king there in Persia during the time of Cyrus, and the people in the territory didn't want to have somebody, as they might see it, well, what if they are able to establish something? It's better for us to be vassals under the king from a very, very distant place, as opposed to somebody right here in our backyard. You could make the case for that as being possible. I think the better explanation of it, very simply, and it may very well play along with that too, but the devil wants to see this stopped. He doesn't want to see the people of God back in a place where they're offering and doing things right before God, because that would be, obviously the children of Israel are really ultimately the prize. And so if you can get them to not be able to do what they want to, discourage them, then their pursuit after God is certainly not going to be a fruitful one. So again, message sent, message received, and now they had their desired outcome. So we see in verse 23, now when the copy of King Artaxerxes' letter was read before Rahum, then Shimshai the scribe and their companions, they went with haste to Jerusalem against the Jews, and by force of arms they made them cease. So these same people that said, we want to help you build the temple because we worship the same God you do. Really? Now they didn't get the easy thing. Now they didn't get the bait. The Jewish people did not take the bait. Now those same people who wanted to make it seem like they were their best friends are now their adversaries. Verse 24, thus the work of the house of God, which is at Jerusalem, ceased, and it was discontinued until the 2nd year of the reign of Darius, the king of Persia. So you have to look on your list of those kings, and your big names are going to be Xerxes, you're going to have Cyrus, and now you're going to have Darius in the first of those lines, and that will be them be able to start doing this all over again. So the parallel books, as we get to chapters 5 and 6, that'll close out the first part of this. Again, Haggai is a good one to be looking at that time. There are really interesting intrigues that take place. Again, Daniel is one of the prophets around this time in Persia, and it's just such an important time for the children of Israel. And it sure would look, I would think, it would sure look as though, great, God is going to bring them back and establish them in the land. You would think, if you're there at the time, God will raise up for us a king again, we'll be a nation again, we'll control the land again. I'm sure that they all had that in their own hearts and minds. God may very well have done that, had it not been for the idea that the nation would rebel again in pretty short order by the time that Nehemiah comes around. As we get to that time, we'll go through Ezra and Nehemiah. We're going to see all of that. It's a very sad part of their history for me personally as I study through it. So with that said, we're going to pick up at chapter 5 next week, and we'll look into it a little bit further with the image that I put up for you. If you weren't able to screenshot that of the different feasts that take place, then please go ahead and contact me, and I can send it to you through the email. You can send an email to me first of all, and that is found at oldpaththeology.net. There is an email link that is there, so you can send that to me, and I'll be happy to send it back to you through the email link that you send or that you reply to. I'll reply back and I'll send you the list of it if you don't have your own. You can find these types of lists of the feasts of Israel online, but if you'd like that particular one, you're more than welcome to contact me, and I'll be willing to send it to you. So with that being said, we pick up at chapter 5 next week, and do yourself a favor. It's only a couple of chapters. Go read the book of Haggai, because it tells you a parallel history to this time and what was going on from the prophet's point of view, rather than just simply the historic, they're going back to rebuild the land. So we'll pick it up next week.